What are some declassified government documents that are surprisingly terrifying? This isn't really a classified document, but at one point the US government was telling people to build your own bomb shelter to protect your family. And it showed how to dig a 8 by 4 by 10 hole in your backyard, and if there is a nuclear threat to get your family and go in there and cover it with a door. So obviously that wouldn't really protect anyone in the case of a nuclear attack. Later it came out that the purpose of telling families to do that was so, if there was a nuclear attack on American soil, they wouldn't have to bury as many bodies because the families dug their own grave. So yeah, not classified but along the same disturbing stuff the US government did. I have a copy of this pamphlet. A lot of the designs seemed really stupid. The door with two kiddie pools filled with sand in it, one in particular though in its defense, that one was supposed to be in your basement. Devil Eyes. The plan after 9/11 to make figurines that look like Osama bin Laden and give them to kids in South Asia. After it's left in the sun for a certain amount of time, its face would peel off to reveal a demon-like visage with red skin, green eyes, and black markings. Basically a demon. The objective was to scare kids and their parents, so bin Laden and Al-Qaeda would lose support. You should watch The Holy Mountain. In it they talk about knowing they will have to go to war with a country in 15 years. They make comic books and toys with a villain that looks like that other race. They also make ipecac type medicine the same color as the skin of that race. All sorts of things to prepare kids to hate a particular races by the time they are of military age and the war is fought. That's one of the weirdest and surreal films I've seen. The bit when two people are making out in the back of a car, and it cuts to a goldfish out of water struggling to breathe, made me laugh every time. When the Space Shuttle Challenger was destroyed, it was reported that all 7 astronauts were killed instantly. It was revealed decades later that some, if not all of the astronauts survived the initial explosion, as the cockpit cabin had enough protection to not be breached. For 2 minutes and 45 seconds, they were awake and aware as they plummeted toward the Atlantic Ocean. Understandably, NASA knew that the news of their terrifying death would have crippled the space program even more than it already was. We looked at this in flight school and pretty much, there's evidence to support that the crew was still running their procedures, even after it was obvious Speep hit the fan. They didn't die accepting their fate. They died astronauts. That's something to be admired, Mo. The same happened with Columbia. The crew were working the systems to try to troubleshoot and recover even as the space shuttle was burning up and breaking apart around them. The crew cabin was the last piece to break apart. It's tragic but also epic. Epitome of the human spirit to continue to fight despite the odds. Read the book 1 second after. It's about what happens after an EMP attack on the U.S. It's based on actual government studies and estimates. It is terrifying. The Nixon administration had a speech prepared for if the moon landing had failed, and it's chilling. You can read it here. Really is chilling. Imagine if they landed on the moon and were unable to lift off again. Just having to sit there and stare at Earth as they die. Yikes. Imagine looking up at the moon today and knowing there are 2 bodies up there, staring at 2 corpses every night. I like to think they'd have sent someone to bring the bodies back. And the movies about that mission would be doing huge box office numbers, I bet. We got to go retrieve Matt Damon. Again. There are over 50 mishaps with nuclear weapons by the US Air Force in the 1950s alone. Lol, we had a plane arrive in Barksdale carrying a live nuke and nobody knew how it got on the plane. Oh, Air Force. Oh, I remember when that happened. Not long after I joined. It wasn't just 1 nuke, but 6 of them. The Air Force literally was missing 6 nukes and had no idea. Not long after that they accidentally shipped ICBM parts to Taiwan. My previous answer to another post. Not sure if this has been mentioned or not. I'm not scrolling through a million replies. The site is run by a guy named John Greenwald, u/Blackvault, started putting in FOIA requests when he was 15 and never stopped. currently has what is arguably the largest privately owned collection of declassified information from the US government anywhere, and the entire archive is accessible for free. Not a direct answer to your question, but anything you want to know about stuff the US government was up to can be found buried in there, and he's taken the time to sort some of the more interesting stuff out to make browsing easier. Cheers. His Black Vault podcast is always a good listen, even if you don't buy into the UFO stuff. He doesn't hesitate to point out the bullspeak from anyone, whether they are believers in this stuff or not, and gives a lot of time to skeptics to put their side of the argument, and treats everyone with respect. Operation Midnight Climax. The government hired sex workers to dose Johns with LSD for research purposes, so to speak. Midnight_climax. Threat level midnight. Jump to the right and shake a hand. Jump to the left and you shake that hand. Meet new friends. Tyson Yarn. That's how ya do the scan. Here's one from the Brits and the Aussies in the 50s. Nuclear tests in Maralinga. Oh yeah. Some aboriginals lived nearby. The government were going to nuke Scotland for a while, I think. Then they realized that was a stupid idea, as Scotland is a pretty small place relatively speaking, and nuked Australia instead. I'm kind of surprised they didn't do as the Americans and nuke a territory in the Pacific. The Pitcairn Islands are still British, and they didn't care about protecting endangered species then. Australia was independent in the '50s. I can't imagine the High Commissioner asking if we could nuke part of Australia. The Pitcairn Islands are still British, and they didn't care about protecting endangered species then. But that's where we keep our pedos. So I research Cold War science, notably nuclear weapons, for a living. So it's hard to find documents that make me a little sick to my stomach. The absolute worst though are the ones in which US generals ran through nuclear war plans and their consequences. Here are a bunch of serious, patriotic, hard-working people, all of whom believe in the ideals of the country and all that, and they're having conversations about killing of hundreds of millions of people, nearly all of them civilians, because they believed that this was the only way to keep the same thing from happening to American civilians. Every once in a while there is someone who says, in essence, what the f*** are we doing? It's rare, but it happened. And that is both kind of refreshing and kind of terrible in its own light. Like, if they never asked that, it'd be creepy, but you'd be able to say, well, they really just never saw it as a problem. But the fact that every once in a while someone says something like, this sounds like the Wannsee Conference, the meeting at which the Nazis hashed out the final solution of the Jews, makes it clear that these people, somewhere deep inside, no, this isn't really the way that decent people ought to be acting. Here's an account from a war planner at a meeting in 1960. The meeting took place near mid-December 196,057 at Strategic Air Command SAC headquarters at a F Air Force Base near Omaha, Nebraska, attended by Secretary Gates, Deputy Secretary Jim Douglas, myself, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and a multitude of general officers representing every unified and specified command from all over the world. After presenting a few charts, he came to one defining the first wave of attacks to reach the Soviet Union. As I recall, these came from carrier-based fighter bombers stationed near Okinawa. Having made this disclosure, he stepped aside. Thereupon 2 airmen appeared, one from each side of the long wall lined with maps, each carrying a tall stepladder. Each airman stopped at the edge of the large map which, we now observed, showed China and the Soviet Union, and probably some other nearby features on a heroic scale. Each man climbed his tall ladder at the same brisk rate, reaching the top at the same instant as his counterpart. Each reached up toward a red ribbon which, we now noticed, encircled a large roll of clear plastic. With a single motion, each untied the boatnet securing the ribbon at his end of the roll, whereupon the plastic sheet unrolled with a whoosh, flapped a bit and then dangled limply in front of the map. Each time the briefer described an attack wave, the ballet of the ladder masters would be reenacted. They would untie another pair of red ribbons, a plastic roll would come whooshing down, and Moscow would be even further obliterated beneath the little marks on those layers of plastic sheets. There were little marks in other places, too. But somebody noted that a third of Soviet industrial military strength was concentrated in the greater Moscow area, hence the concentration of bombs dropped on that region. I recall that the plan called for a total of 40 megatons on Moscow, about 4,000 times more than the bomb over Hiroshima and perhaps 20 to 30 times more than all the non-nuclear bombs dropped by the Allies in both theaters during more than 4 years of WWII. At the point in the briefing where some bombers were described flying northeast from the Mediterranean on their way to Moscow, General Power waved at the speaker, saying, "Just a minute. Just a minute." He then turned in his front row chair to stare into the obscurity of uniforms and dusk stretching behind me and said, "I just hope none of you have any relatives in Albania, because they have a radar station there that is right on our flight path, and we take it out." With that, to which the response was utter silence, Power turned to the speaker and with another wave of the hand, told him to go ahead. A subsequent chart shown by the briefer displayed deaths on the vertical axis and time in hours, extending out to weeks, along the horizontal axis. He announced that there were about 175 million people in the USSR. This chart depicted the deaths from fallout alone or not from the direct effects of blast or radiation from a bomb going off, just from fallout subsequent to the attacks when radioactive dust propelled to high altitudes by the initial blast begins to fall back to Earth. The curve of deaths, rising as time went by, leveled off at about 100 million, showing that more than half the population of the Soviet Union would be killed from radioactive fallout alone. The briefing was soon concluded, to be followed by an identical one covering the attack on China, given by a different speaker. Eventually, he too arrived at a chart showing deaths from fallout alone. "There are about 600 million Chinese in China," he said. His chart went up to half that number, 300 million, on the vertical axis. It showed that deaths from fallout as time passed after the attack leveled out at that number, 300 million, half the population of China. A voice out of the gloom from somewhere behind me interrupted, saying, "May I ask a question?" General Power turned again in his front row seat, stared into the darkness and said, "Yeah. What is it?" In a tone not likely to encourage the timid. "What if this isn't China's war?" The voice asked. "What if this is just a war with the Soviets? Can you change the plan?" "Well, yeah," said General Power resignedly, "we can. But I hope nobody thinks of it, because it would really screw up the plan." That exchange did it. Already oppressed by the briefings up to that point, I shrank within, horrified. I thought of the Wannsee Conference in January 1942, when an assemblage of German bureaucrats swiftly agreed on a program to exterminate every last Jew they could find anywhere in Europe, using methods of mass extermination more technologically efficient than the vans filled with exhaust gases, the mass shootings, or incineration in barns and synagogues used until then. I felt as if I were witnessing a comparable descent into the deep heart of darkness. A twilight underworld governed by disciplined, meticulous and energetically mindless groupthink aimed at wiping out half the people living on nearly 1/3 of the Earth's surface. Those feelings have not entirely abated, even though more than 40 years have passed since that dark moment. Excerpts from John H. Rubel, Doomsday Delayed, Use of Strategic Weapons Doctrine and PSYOP 62. 19,591,962. Lanham, M.D. Hamilton Books. 2008. 2339. As quoted in Daniel Ellsberg, The Doomsday Machine. Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner _. Other than that, this was never classified, but reading the official US guidance for how to dispose of millions of corpses in the event of a nuclear attack is pretty chilling. To plan and organize for the disposal of the bodies of millions of civilians killed in an enemy nuclear attack is a grim business, even for those trained and accustomed to the work of mortuaries. The individual care we traditionally bestow on our deceased will not be physically possible when the dead must be counted in the thousands. However, FCDA, with the assistance of its Religious Advisory Committee, is planning for suitable memorial services for the dead in areas devastated by enemy attack. Final legal identification by personal recognition will not be possible because of the large number of dead, wide dispersal of the population after a disaster, and lack of necessary space, time, and labor. 10,000 unidentified bodies would require over 5 acres of space, 250,000 square feet for adequate display. A person would walk 5 miles between the rows of bodies before all was seen, and for each 25,000 identifiable bodies, probably 10,000 would be unrecognizable because of disfigurement by injury or fire. Mortuary and burial areas selected should have space to accommodate about 25% more than the maximum expected number of bodies. A method of rapid, mechanical grave digging and filling will be needed for the large number of graves required. If conditions permit, mechanically dug continuous trenches offer the best solution to the burial problem. If the machines available are capable only of digging narrow trenches, bodies can be placed head to foot instead of side by side. The above and this amazing flowchart can be found in the 1956 Federal Civil Defense Administration publication, Mortuary Services in Civil Defense. Well, that was enough of his thud for me. Boeing X-37B unmanned space shuttle. It just spent 720 days in space doing God knows what. Testing stuff. And maybe taking pictures like the one Trump tweeted of the Iranian space launch site. Edit. Apparently the USAF has disclosed that it's testing a heat pipe assembly, but I'm sure there's other stuff we're not allowed to know about. The Trump tweet was from the last war version of the KH-11 spy satellites. Scott Manley on YouTube has a solid video breaking it down. In East Germany, a committed freedom fighter and her husband had dealt with having her home raided while she was away, being arrested on the way to protests and all sorts of state-sponsored harassment. After the wall fell, she was able to read the documents the Stasi had kept on her, and found out her own husband was an undercover agent, and had written many reports on her activities with a bloodless banality. British Metropolitan Police Services have done exactly the same on ecological protesters from organizations like Greenpeace. There was literally a case a few years back, like 5 years ago. An undercover cop, I believe, married and even had kids with a protester he was investigating the whole way through. And then he didn't have to pay child support costs, he was on the job. And our government said they weren't liable either. Peeping joke.